Hey everyone, welcome to the most opinionated space podcast on the internet, Ad Astra, the podcast where we talk about the intersection between space, policy, and technology. I'm your host, Jack Corelli, a Master's of Public Policy in Science and Space Policy, and I will be your lone host for the beginning of this episode. Unfortunately, between me and Newton, we weren't able to find a time on our usual recording day of Monday to sit down and record, so we're doing it separately. Newton is going to be recording the latest in tech as well as the international news update, and I'm covering the latest from Washington, the space news highlight of the week, and some of Coming Soon to Space. So first off, let me say thank you to everyone that attended Nerd Night on Saturday this last weekend. It was great to see everyone and good to meet a couple new faces. I hope you are enjoying the podcast so far. I know it's a bit of a weird episode to start off on, but definitely go back through our archive and listen to some of our greatest hits episodes. But yeah, so thank you all for everyone that came and signed up for the podcast, and everyone that we talked to. It was great meeting you and hope to hear from you soon in the future. The next big thing that I'd like to announce is that we have a winner for the first ever Ad Astra t-shirt design contest. So for people who have not been following, back in August, that was our first month in which we got over 1,000 downloads for the show. And that for a podcast that started in March of this year is an amazing accomplishment. So thank you all to everyone who has downloaded, who has listened, who has followed along and engaged with us on social media and in person. We could not be doing this without you. But without further ado, I'm going to announce that the winner of the Ad Astra t-shirt design contest, after a very close race between three very great designs, is the floating astronaut design from listener and good friend of the show, Antonio Perinace. So Antonio will be coming on the show in a special episode in the next couple weeks to discuss what the inspiration for his design, why he's interested in space, and how you can get involved with the things that he's been doing. Thank you to everyone who submitted a design as well as everyone who voted. It was a great to see that everyone was so engaged and interested in the future of this show. I'll download link for the design. I guess we'll put on the website as well once it's been finalized. But we will be selling t-shirts in the very near future. So be on the lookout for that. So I guess without further ado, I'll go into latest from Washington, cover our space news highlight of the week, and talk about Coming Soon to Space. So it's going to be a pretty short episode. So the first thing I wanted to cover was that there's no more Space Corps in the National Defense Authorization Act. So for people who have been following along, the NDAA is an authorization, so it doesn't appropriate money. It does not give the Department of Defense money, but it gives it guidance. It sets the policy, the tone of the next year. The NDAA tends to be a yearly commitment that the Congress goes through. But so a big thing that happened this year was Mike Rogers and Jim Cooper, a Republican and Democrat respectively, who are on the House committee that deals with security and defense, put an amendment onto this year's NDAA that would require a Space Corps to become almost akin to what the Marine Corps is under the Navy. We'd have a Space Corps under the Air Force. This comes after many years of debate within sort of closed doors, the academic side, about what the next step for defense space is going to be. I know we talk very openly about civil space and commercial space, but defense space is a major investment on part of the federal government. Within the Department of Defense, it's hard to delineate where in the Department of Defense the space budget ends. It's not as clear as, say, the civil space budget, but roughly about the same size, so close to about $20 billion a year are spent within the Department of Defense on space-based or space-related activities. And some of those things include, purchasing launches, tracking satellites, tracking space debris is a big thing, building new ground systems, new installations to track space objects and provide the logistical support to the rest of the space community. And so the idea behind the Space Corps was that it would be the next step in evolution for the sort of space regime under the Department of Defense and consolidate everything in the Department of Defense that deals with space under one roof. So it would be like akin to the Marine Corps, everything that the Navy did in terms of I guess land combat, and sort of the transition between sea and land and air and land and air and sea would be covered by the Marine Corps. I know it's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's sort of the idea with the Space Corps, is that everything dealing with space would go underneath the Space Corps, and you'd have a chief of staff for the Space Corps. You would have a bunch of new positions that would open up, and it would sort of create a bit more bureaucracy when it came to defense space, which many argue would be a good thing, because space in the defense arena is not something that's very clearly delineated, isn't very clearly defined, and sort of with the growing, I guess one of the big arguments is that there's a growing threat from Russia and China, as well as from non-state or rogue state actors, so ISIS, North Korea, Iran, in their developing of a more robust defense-oriented space capabilities, and especially with Russia and China probably being the bigger threat to U.S. Hegemony in space. So the idea was that this next step for space within the Air Force would solidify our place in space, as well as move our capabilities and our abilities forward, both organizationally, so being able to control who does what better, as well as developing new technologies within the Air Force to use. So, developing a new space fence, developing new surveillance technologies. Because as it stands, the Air Force basically does all monitoring of space debris and satellites in space, and sort of being able to centralize all that is going to arguably create better cohesiveness across the entire space regime that the U.S. is involved with. So, that's background aside. The National Defense Authorization Act had a provision in it this year in the House version of it. So Mike Rogers and Jim Cooper are both in the House, not the Senate. And the House had a provision in it that would require by beginning of 2019 there to be a Space Corps organized, set up, ready to go January 1st, 2019. In the Senate version of the bill, there was no provision about this, and actually there was a stipulation that prevented the appropriators from putting money towards a Space Corps. So, when the House and the Senate have gone into conference on, because they have to pass the same bill basically within a certain margin of error, that then it gets signed by the president. So the House and the Senate have been debating this for a while, mostly behind closed doors. And there's been a lot of talk about whether the members of the House Committee on Defense was going to budge, and whether this was going to be one of the big points of contention in this debate. And obviously it is not what they are going to put their political will behind, because as of November 8th, last Wednesday, there is no Space Corps in the final NDAA, which is expected to pass in the next couple weeks and go on to be signed by the president. So I guess the story of the Space Corps ends for now. However, I foresee in the next year a lot more talk about Space Corps. There's been a lot more articles I've seen on social media, in regular media, about the need for a more clear and cohesive understanding and set of rules and strategies within the Department of Defense when it comes to space. So I don't think Space Corps is going away anytime soon, and this is merely a roadblock for it. Again, if you haven't listened to previous episodes, I haven't been the biggest fan of Space Corps right now, but I do agree that we are going to need to elevate the position of space within the Department of Defense as we get more involved in the space domain. The last thing we want is for another anti-satellite test, an ASAT test like the one back in 2007, where the Chinese blew up a civilian satellite, one of their own. It wasn't like an act of war or anything, but they created 25% more space debris, and we've been dealing with that ever since. So we have to be prepared for those things, but I don't see China, Russia, North Korea, I mean, and even our allies in Europe and Canada and I mean, just across the world, I don't see them making up ground so fast that in the next 5 years we're going to need something as intense as a Space Corps, let alone a Space Force, being an entire new branch of the military dedicated to space. But I think we need to maybe set up some reports, some trials, do some testing on this whole idea, what it would look like, what are some best practices. And I mean, even look at the way that China and Russia are progressing and almost match that to a certain extent. So I think we need a little bit more deliberation than this just being something mandated by Congress. So I guess that's it. All I have to say about the Space Corps. If you have any questions on anything that I talk about, please feel free to reach out to me at astra@elemental.fm. The next thing that I wanted to talk about was, and Newton will talk a little bit more about this later, about the Orbital ATK launch that launched out of Wallops Air Force Base just this last weekend. So it was planned for Saturday at 7:37 in the morning. There was supposed to be a launch of the Cygnus spacecraft delivering cargo to the International Space Station. OA-8 is the name of the mission, and this is as you can probably guess, the 8th in a series of missions sending cargo to the International Space Station. This is based off a contract that Orbital ATK won alongside SpaceX to get cargo up to the ISS commercially. But unfortunately, Orbital ATK has not had a great history of launching things from Wallops, and this is only the second, I think, if I'm correct, it's the second launch out of Wallops since they had a major accident. OA-6 was the major accident about 3 years ago, actually, at this point, where the Cygnus spacecraft blew up on the launch pad and they lost all the cargo and they had to make up that cargo launch with SpaceX. So OA-8 was planned to go for launch. Beautiful day at 7:37 in the morning, and it was stopped by a wayward plane. So the FAA, as you would expect, understands that you can't fly planes over rockets, so they issued a no-fly zone, an exclusionary zone around the launch site, and built in a buffer just in case. You don't want to, the rocket to go off and have a less than nominal trajectory and go outside of a smaller exclusionary zone. So the FAA sets up this exclusionary zone and tells all pilots, I'm sure they have a set-up way that they do this, where they send out emails or phone calls, or there's a certain thing that you get from the FAA as a commercial pilot as well as a private pilot that let you know you're not supposed to fly in this area. Well, unfortunately, starting at about around right before 7:30, a rocket or a plane was. A private plane, in fact, was flying an altitude of about 500 feet, about 6 miles off the coast of Virginia, and scrubbed the entire launch. They only really had a launch window of a couple minutes, and I guess people have been rather upset with this one particular pilot, and I guess as they should be. The launch happened the next day, yesterday, or as I'm recording this, 2 days ago on Sunday, went off without a hitch. It was another beautiful day out at Wallops. But this brings up an interesting question of how the FAA is handling commercial space flight as part of their duties as a federal agency. So as it stands, there is an Office of Commercial Spaceflight, the AST, within FAA, and they are in charge of giving out all the permits and everything for commercial space companies to launch. So Orbital ATK had to go to the Office of Commercial Spaceflight and get a permit and say, this is when we want to launch. And then that office took it to the FAA at large, and they put up the exclusionary zone, and everything was fine. Obviously, then something is wrong with the way that the FAA disseminates this information to private pilots. And this could be I guess, one of the problems with having a very separate office for commercial space flight within the FAA, in that there isn't really that much cohesion within the FAA about commercial space launches. What I think, though, is that there needs to be a better way in which the FAA can communicate to pilots, both commercial and private, about space launches. I think as our presence in space, and especially commercial presence in space, increases over time, and we're reaching this point where low Earth orbit is a hotbed of commercial development, that there needs to be a better way to ingrain space into the everyday lives of everyone that deals with the federal government on some level, and especially when it comes to airspaces. Because I mean, if you have someone violating an airspace because they didn't get the message or they didn't check their email that morning, there's got to be a better way to set this up. Now, there hasn't been much news as of recording this as to what the motives of the pilot were. I mean, the pilot could very well have seen the email and said, all right, well, I'm going to, mess around with with NASA today and with Orbital ATK and just get in their way for a little bit. But I think it's more likely than not a mishap where the information was not communicated properly to the pilot, and the pilot thought, oh, today's a beautiful day to go flying. Let me, jump in my Cessna and fly off. But I think there needs to be a serious conversation about how we grow sustainably with commercial space. It's very hard. I mean, the government has to move and upgrade itself and evolve with commercial space, as that arena is so. There's a lot of uncertainty right now, but it's grown so much in the last 15 years that we haven't seen a similar growth within the federal government to accompany that. And I just don't want to get to the point where the federal government can't keep up and is too far behind commercial space and is, in fact, almost inhibiting the ability for commercial space. And this was something that was brought up at the National Space Council hearing a couple weeks ago, when members of companies like Orbital ATK and Lockheed Martin and Boeing told the members of NSPAC that they just want more clarity in the regulation. Not that we need more regulation or less regulation. It's not a conversation about that. It's clarity. And if the United States is going to be the epicenter of commercial spaceflight growth, we need to tackle this head on. And I think we need to start having serious conversations about creating institutions within the federal government that can grow with commercial spaceflight. Whether that's a whole new agency, which would be a monstrous task and something that the Congress would have to be involved in, or elevating the position of NSPAC and working with all of the various organizations that are part of NSPAC, which include the Department of Commerce and Department of Transportation. FAA and NOAA are among those in those departments, that will allow us to sustainably grow with commercial spaceflight. So that's all I'm going to say about the Orbital ATK. Newton will cover that as well as much more on the technology side later on. The next thing I wanted to bring up was that it was just announced, NASA just announced that the Exploratory Mission 1 or Exploration Mission 1, EM1, for the SLS and Orion spacecraft is going to be delayed to December 2019. So news came out I think it was actually a couple months ago at this point, that the timetable was slipping from late 2018 to early 2019 for the combined SLS Orion launch. But now it's slipping even more and going to December 2019. And for those that aren't aware, EM1 was supposed to be an uncrewed mission, is going to be almost a replica of the Apollo 8 mission, in which the spacecraft went around the moon, but was uncrewed for this one, EM1. And this would come 50 years, December 2019. In July 2019 is the 50th anniversary of Apollo. And so there's been a lot of talk about trying to get these things to coincide, that, our return to space is going to come about on the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11, or at least within the same year. But as the timetable starts to slip, and from my understanding, has mostly to do with the ground servicing of SLS and Orion. SLS and Orion, SLS is being built in large part by Boeing in Huntsville, Alabama, and Orion is being built by Lockheed Martin in I think a couple facilities, Langley being one of them. And EM1 is going to be the first test of these systems combined. With a slip to December 2019, that means that the EM2, which is supposed to be the first crewed, is going to slip from 2023. Yeah, there's already going to be a 4-year difference between EM1 and EM2 just because of how complicated of machinery this is. That with a slip in EM1, we could very well see a slip in EM2 as well, which does push us further and further back. The benefit that we have, though, is as we get closer and closer to EM2, our ability to build SLS rockets and Orion spacecraft is going to become a lot quicker. So the turnaround time isn't going to be 4 years between launches, and hopefully we're going to have a launch every year or every 2 years, conservatively speaking, which would mean that by 2030, we're going to have regular flights to not just low Earth orbit. That would sort of be a waste of the power of the SLS rocket, but to the Deep Space Gateway, which is going to be in cislunar space, so around the moon and beyond. So this is going to be integral to our journey to Mars. So it is a little interesting to see that the schedule has slipped again. I would not say concerning. These things happen. You have to expect space is difficult. You have to expect that there are going to be challenges along the way that we have not foreseen. This is one of the most complicated things we've ever done, and we haven't really put enough weight on that. I don't think that's been ingrained in people's minds. And with the growth of commercial space flight, people almost assume, oh, space is easy or it's getting easier. Well, no, space is still very difficult. The rocket equation hasn't changed since Robert Goddard. The way that we get to space is pretty set in stone right now. Very big vehicles, and the further away you have to go, the more fuel you have to bring. And this is, I guess, to borrow what some folks have said, including Newt Gingrich, is that about 90 to 95% of your space budget is going to be getting off the planet. Getting from Earth to Mars, although a difficult feat, especially if you're dealing with humans, that is going to be a lot easier than getting a lot of stuff into space. So I would not say that I am concerned, and you should not be concerned too much about this slip from early 2019 to December 2019. And I guess, I mean, if you're looking at it from a marketing perspective, that just means the 2020s are going to be the era of returning to space, to deep space, especially if you want to look at it from the human exploration perspective. So on to the space news highlight of the week. I just wanted to highlight that the nominee for NASA Administrator, Jim Bridenstine, a person that we've talked a lot about on this show, has passed his first hurdle, or I guess second hurdle. I said the first hurdle was the meeting on November 1st, but the second hurdle then is the committee vote. And so the committee voted 14-13 along party lines to pass Jim Bridenstine on to the full Senate. So now that Jim Bridenstine is on to the full Senate, he is going to need 51 out of 100 votes in the Senate to move on to be confirmed as the administrator of NASA. That changed. So if we can look back to the good old days of 2013, Harry Reid, who was at the time the Senate Majority Leader when the Democrats had a majority in the Senate, changed the rules so that instead of a nominee needing 60 votes to pass the Senate, that they instead needed a simple majority, which is 50% plus one. In the Senate, because there's only 100 members, would be 51 votes. So we're looking at the next couple weeks for this vote, with the Senate being as busy as it is with this tax reform bill that they're working on, and working on getting funding, getting past the CR, which ends on December 8th. The continuing resolution, which is funding the government, with sort of our expectation being that they're going to just push this off until next year and begin the next budget cycle with the FY 2019. That we're going to see a vote on Bridenstine just to sort of get it over with. And I would wager to say that it's going to be a party line vote, the same way it was in the committee, with it being 52 Republicans voting for him and 48 Democrats and independents voting against. The only thing I would really be that concerned about would be if there is any wavering of support on the Republican side. The detractors, the people against Jim Bridenstine being the next NASA administrator, only need 3 Republicans to switch and vote no in order for them to halt that nomination, probably throwing Bridenstine back into committee or forcing the administration to nominate someone else, which would severely hurt the I guess nonpartisan nature of space. So I'm not too worried, but that is something to keep in mind with everything that's going on with tax reform, with a number of senators already announcing that they're against some of the administration's priorities. They could use Bridenstine as as a defining moment to say, this is enough. We need to nominate, the right people. Not to say Bridenstine is not a good person to be administrator. I guess I fully support Bridenstine. He's the best we can do under current circumstances, but I just would be worried that if 3 Republicans switch over and do not support him, with a very real risk of Marco Rubio, who is not on the committee that accepted Bridenstine's nomination, but he has voiced his concern as a Floridian against Bridenstine, mainly due to political problems with him, not anything pertaining to policy or space policy. Marco Rubio's, I guess, just a little upset that Bridenstine endorsed Ted Cruz over him in the 2016 presidential primary for the Republicans, but that's neither here nor there. So at the very least, Bridenstine, I would expect him to get 51 out of the 100 votes, that would barely get him by. Worst case scenario, we lose 2 more Republicans or more, and this gets, of course, thrown back to the administration to pick a new NASA administrator, or to cut some deals and keep Bridenstine as the nominee. But this is something to be following. I think this could very well be a very defining moment for the administration to get this passed. And assuming Bridenstine becomes the next administrator, we'll have a lot of things to deal with on his first day, hopefully starting in December. So that's going to be it for our latest from Washington and our Space News highlight of the week. I just have one thing on my calendar coming up, and actually by the time you're listening to this episode, it will probably already have passed. So JPSS-1, which is a NOAA satellite, the Joint Polar Satellite System, the first of its kind, is going to be launched on a Delta II rocket from Vandenberg Air Force Base on tomorrow, which, as of recording this, that is the 15th. So if you are listening to this on Wednesday, that means that this launch has already happened or has been scrubbed. It was supposed to launch on November 10th. However, due to some technical concerns, that launch was moved to the 14th today, but also due to some weird things, I guess, going on. According to Space Policy Online, two technical problems had developed over the course of last night. So they're moving the launch to tomorrow, or for those of you listening to today, the 15th. So if that has not happened, please check your local listings for the new scheduled time for the JPSS-1 launch. So that is it for my segment of the show. I guess I will pass you on to Newton. Again, I'm Jack, your friendly neighborhood space policy expert. So thank you again for listening, and be on the lookout for information on how to buy the first Ad Astra t-shirt on elemental.fm. Talk to you guys later. Ad Astra.
Hey there, Ad Astra fans. It's Newton here. Jack and I couldn't sync up our schedules this week, but nevertheless, I'm here to deliver your international news and This Week in Tech, or in this case, a quick week in tech. So let's get started with international news. Vega, an expendable launch system in use by Arianespace, which is jointly developed by the Italian Space Agency and the European Space Agency, has launched an Earth observation satellite for Morocco. That's right, Arianespace has launched a Vega rocket to deliver an Earth observation satellite into orbit for the Kingdom of Morocco. Morocco has successfully launched an Earth observation satellite, the European consortium Arianespace announced on Wednesday. They have dubbed the rocket Mohammed 6A. It was launched by Arianespace's Vega rocket from French Guiana Space Center on Tuesday at 10:42 p.m. local time in Kourou. It is an Earth observation satellite built by the Kingdom of Morocco by Thales Alenia Space as system prime contractor and Airbus as co-prime. The three-axis stabilized satellite weighed approximately 1,100 kilograms at launch. It will be used for mapping and land surveying activities, regional development, agricultural monitoring, the prevention and management of natural disasters, monitoring changes in the environment and desertification, as well as border and coastal surveillance. It was the 11th consecutive successful launch of a Vega rocket since 2012. Thales Alenia Space supplied the payload, including the optical instruments, the image transmission subsystem, and the ground segment for image processing and production. Thales Alenia Space has been part of the Ariane program for more than 40 years. The group posted consolidated revenues of about 2.4 billion euros in 2016 and has 7,980 employees in 9 countries. Airbus was in charge of the Mohammed 6A integration, as well as supplying the platform and the ground segment for mission planning and satellite control. It's the 150th satellite built by Thales Alenia Space to be launched by Arianespace, which has 15 more satellites from this manufacturer in its order book. The space imagery operated from Morocco will play a key role in the implementation of national strategies for socioeconomic development, especially those relating to the agricultural sector, which constitutes one of the main pillars of the Moroccan economy. This is a big move for Morocco, and we're going to see what happens next. Moving on to latest in tech, light from a supernova explosion in the nearby starburst galaxy M82 is reverberating off a huge dust cloud in interstellar space. The Hubble Space Telescope captured the light echoes of a distant supernova rebounding off a dust cloud in a distant galaxy. On January 21st, 2014, a star in the M82 galaxy, which lies about 11.4 million light years away and can be found near the bowl of the Big Dipper, exploded in a supernova named SN 2014J. Creative naming, I know. So back in 2014, astronomers witnessed a supernova soon after it exploded in the Messier 82 or M82 galaxy. Telescopes across the globe and in space turned their attention to study this newly exploded star, including Chandra. Astronomers determined that this supernova, dubbed SN 2014J, belongs to a class of explosions called Type 1A supernovas. These supernovas are used as cosmic distance markers and played a key role in the discovery of the universe's accelerated expansion, which has been attributed to the effects of a dark energy. Scientists think that all Type 1A supernovas involve the detonation of a white dwarf. One important question is whether the fuse on the explosion is lit when the white dwarf pulls too much material from a companion star like the Sun, or when two white dwarf stars emerge. So basically, the image of M82 reveals a bright blue disk, webs of shredded clouds, and fiery-looking plumes of glowing hydrogen blasting out of its central regions. Close encounters with its larger neighbor, the spiral galaxy M81, is compressing gas in M82 and stoking the birth of multiple star clusters. Some of these stars live for only a short time and die in cataclysmic supernova blasts, as shown by SN 2014J. If you're looking for it, and I urge you to do so using your telescopes, M82 appears high in the northern spring sky in the direction of the constellation Ursa Major, the Great Bear. It is also called the Cigar Galaxy because of the elliptical shape produced by the oblique tilt of its starry disk relative to our line of sight. This is the closest type of explosion that we've seen in about 40 years, so keep an eye out for it. Finally, in latest in tech, I want to talk to you about Antares and their launch of the Cygnus spacecraft to the ISS. This was the Orbital ATK launch that was delayed late on Saturday and then launched early on Sunday. So, an Orbital ATK Antares rocket successfully launched a Cygnus cargo spacecraft packed with supplies and equipment for the International Space Station on November 12th. Topped with the International Space Station bound Cygnus cargo spacecraft, the 139-foot Antares rocket lifted off from NASA's Wallops Flight Facility in Wallops Island, Virginia at 7:19 a.m. About 9 minutes later, Cygnus was deployed in low Earth orbit, where it will spend the next 2 days chasing after the International Space Station. For a little bit of background, the Cygnus spacecraft is an unmanned cargo resupply spacecraft designed and operated by Orbital Sciences Corporation. The Cygnus program started as part of NASA's Commercial Orbital Transportation Services Program, or COTS, and enters the Commercial Resupply Services Program once completing its first demonstration flight. Cygnus transports pressurized cargo to the International Space Station, and in this case, Cygnus will deliver about 7,400 pounds of food, water, clothing, and science equipment to the 6 crew members currently aboard the ISS. About 1,900 pounds, or a quarter of that cargo, will be used for scientific research and technology demonstrations, including a CubeSat filled with E. coli that will study antibiotic resistance, a new laser-based communication system, and experiments that will investigate how plants and insects grow in microgravity. So that's great news coming out of Wallops Island. We're happy to see that the Cygnus spacecraft made it off to ISS. Once again, this has been your international news and latest in tech. Until next week, sorry that I couldn't make it to the actual live podcast, but I've been Newton Campbell, and this has been your latest in tech and international news.